it's not anything to be ashamed of to say, well, it kind of looks like that structure's worked quite well for the entire duration of mankind, and so maybe we mess with it at our peril.
You're hearing about family values from the childless and unmarried. Don't follow them.
The women have to stop blaming men for their sense of malaise or misery.
I didn't create you people to kill and torture and rape each other. I created you to be good to each other. I love the God who had a flood.
Hey, so I'm trying out a new format where I just record my voice and then, put it on the screen later, because I can easily stream my thoughts as I'm doing other things as opposed to having to, sit down and video record in front of the computer. This particular rant is on the non-aggression principle, which I am not very fond of. Not because I like violence or anything, but I've realized that out of pure self-interest, it just doesn't work for me, because it doesn't easily define what qualifies as aggression. It doesn't quantify the level of force necessary to violate the non-aggression principle, and it just throws, in my mind, off the entire premise of the starts of the American Revolution, during which one of the few starter points of that was the Boston Tea Party. And the Boston Tea Party, for those of you who are not aware, is a point where the Americans decided we're being taxed too high for tea. And this is to pay for England, defending us and going to war and being colonialists, kind of like what we signed up for. But we don't like the fact that we were taxed without our consent. So we're going to go to the docks, we're going to dress up as Indians, and we're going to throw the tea into the bay, and that's going to be our Boston Tea Party, a riot, the destruction of property of the English, as a form of protest and as a form of telling England, we're not going to put up with it anymore. Technically, that is a violation of the non-aggression principle. And yet, it was from one of those principled places in American history where we actually began to assert our right to liberty. And it is on this purely selfish note that I have to take a moment and critique the non-aggression principle. Because, let's face it, the Boston Tea Party was an aggressive act, and it was in violation of a legitimate law that was enforced on the American colonialists. So I'm not sure if they were justified under the non-aggression principle. And yet, most libertarians who like American values owe their comfort, their society, and their legal system on that revolution. So I'm having trouble reconciling the historical context of the revolution and this sudden appeasement to a non-aggression principle off the bat. Now, in most cases, in most personal interactions, that the non-aggression principle works 9 times out of 10. But the point is here, when we look at situations like the Boston Tea Party, how do we know? Can we really say that the Boston Tea Party was unjust? Are we really going to have an argument that says, oh, we got here, but I don't like how they did it? I'm sorry, I don't like that attitude. It's incredibly ungrateful. It's incredibly naive as well. This idea that the American colonialists could have left the rule of England with no force whatsoever through peaceful protest or waiting for the English to come and slaughter them is it's not reasonable. It's not reasonable to suppose that force could have been avoided completely and entirely. It's not. I don't think that that's within the scope of reality to say that force should have a morality attached to it. And that's what the non-aggression principle says, is that if you are forcing people to do something or you are destroying property, then you are automatically in the wrong and you should be held accountable for that act. I don't think that that is always the case. I think that when we look at acts like the American Revolution, that a case could be made where forceful acts are justified because of the motivations of those performing the action. Dumping tea into the Boston Harbor, to me, was a justified action to an unjust law. The problem is, when you're in a society and you're bound by a social contract and a law is unjust, how do you appeal to something like the non-aggression principle to justify a protest like the Boston Tea Party? You can't. And that is why, that's a lot of the reason why libertarians are very crap activists. They're constantly hamstrung by this idea that they need to behave in ideological purity to this non-aggression principle. It really stifles their action, it stifles their activism, it stifles their ability to take action where action is needed. And that we need to reassess what is and is not acceptable reaction to when our liberties are infringed. We need to reassess what it means to be truly active, and not just active, but proactive in taking back liberties that A, we deserve, or B, that have been taken from us, or C, that are on the fringe of even being considered to be taken. Because the non-aggression principle, it seems, is one of those linchpins that kind of takes all of the air and the power and the enthusiasm from the libertarian or conservative movements, is this idea that we need to have ideological purity behind the non-aggression principle. And I think that if we were to reassess this idea that force as a whole is always and completely negative, that perhaps we might be more effective activists, that we might be able to negotiate in the political sphere more effectively. Because I'll be honest, it's that level of enthusiasm and action on the ground that gives the left an edge. They are so willing to not just violate their principles, but they're willing to engage. And we need to find a way of justifying fighting for liberty and engage the left, not necessarily on their terms, but in a way that is definitely effective. And I'm sorry, but this non-aggression principle, it sounds good in the abstract, but when it comes to actively fighting for liberty, it just seems like a no-starter. It's one of those things that people will constantly try to drive a wedge between you and effective activism. And that's a point where we have to really come together and say, this isn't working anymore, it needs to be reworked. It needs to be looked at again, and it needs to be fixed, because we've tried it in the abstract and we've applied it. We've taken this abstract concept, we've applied it to reality, and it hasn't worked. We need to fix the non-aggression principle. We need to come up with something better. And that's pretty much it. That's where I'm at with it, because that's where we're failing. That is one of the major reasons why we're failing, and I hope that it rectifies itself soon.